Subject of Analysis. T.Ogden. Chapter 6. Projective Identification and the Subjugating Third. We are still in the process of discovering what projective identification means, not that Mrs. Klein meant all that in 1946, consciously or otherwise. Donald Meltzer, 1978, page 39. In this chapter, I shall offer some reflections on the process of projective identification as a form of intersubjective thirdness. In particular, I shall describe the interplay of mutual subjugation and mutual recognition that I view as fundamental to this psychological interpersonal event. In Klein's 1946-1955 work, projective identification was only implicitly a psychological interpersonal concept. However, the concept as it has been developed by Bion, 1952, 1962a, and H. Rosenfeld, 1952, 1971, 1987, and further enriched by Grotstein, 1981, Joseph, 1987, Kernberg, 1987, Meltzer, 1966, Ogden, 1979, O'Shaughnessy, 1983, Siegel, 1981, and others, has taken on an increasingly complex set of intersubjective meanings and clinical applications. The understanding of projective identification that I shall propose is founded on a conception of psychoanalysis as a process in which a variety of forms of intersubjective thirdness are generated that stand in dialectical tension with the analyst and analysand as separate psychological entities. In projective identification, a distinctive form of analytic thirdness is generated in the dialectic of subjectivity and intersubjectivity that I shall refer to as the subjugating third, since this form of intersubjectivity has the effect of subsuming within it, to a very large degree, the individual subjectivities of the participants. The concept of projective identification. I use the term projective identification to refer to a wide range of psychological interpersonal events, including the earliest forms of mother-infant communication, Bion 1962a, fantasied coercive incursions into an occupation of the personality of another person, schizophrenic confusional states, H. Rosenfeld 1952, and healthy, empathic sharing, Pick 1985, page 45. The understanding of projective identification that will be presented has evolved in the course of a series of papers that I have written over the past 15 years, Ogden 1978a, B, 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982a, B, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1988, 1989a. Detailed descriptions of the phenomenology of projective identification are contained in these papers as well as in chapters 5 and 8 of this volume. Despite the breadth of psychological interpersonal phenomena addressed by the concept, I view projective identification as a discrete form, or more accurately, a quality, of intersubjective experience. Projective identification is not an experience that occurs in isolation from the rest of the emotional life of the individual. It is a quality of emotional life that coexists with a multiplicity of other qualities. It therefore contributes to, rather than defines, it provides colorations to a life experience rather than constituting the entirety of an experience. I view projective identification as a dimension of all intersubjectivity, at times the predominant quality of the experience, at other times only a subtle background. Projective identification involves unconscious narratives, both verbally and non-verbally symbolized, involving the fantasy of evacuating a part of oneself into another person. This fantasied evacuation serves the purpose of either protecting oneself from the dangers posed by an aspect of oneself or of safeguarding a part of oneself by depositing it in another person who is experienced as only partially differentiated from oneself. Klein 1946, 1955, see also Chapter 3. The aspect of oneself that is in unconscious fantasy, residing in the other person is felt to be altered in the process, and under optimal conditions is imagined to be retrieved in a less toxic or endangered form. Alternatively, under pathogenic conditions the reappropriated part may be felt to have been deadened or to have become more persecutory than it had previously been. Inextricably connected with this set of unconscious fantasies is a set of interpersonal correlates to the unconscious fantasies, Bion 1959, Joseph 1987, H. Rosenfeld 1971, 1987. The interpersonal quality of the psychological event does not follow from the unconscious fantasy. The unconscious fantasy and the interpersonal event are two aspects of a single psychological event. The interpersonal facet of projective identification involves a transformation of the subjectivity of the recipient in such a way that the separate I-ness of the other as subject is, for a time and to a degree, subverted. You, the recipient of the projective identification, are me, the projector, to the extent that I need to make use of you for the purpose of experiencing through you what I cannot experience myself. You are not me to the extent that I need to disown an aspect of myself and in fantasy hide myself, disguised as not me, in you. The recipient of the projective identification becomes a participant in the negation of himself as a separate subject, thus making psychological room in himself to be, in unconscious fantasy, occupied, taken over, by the projector. The projector in the process of projective identification has unconsciously entered into a form of negation of himself as a separate I, and in so doing has become other to himself. He has become, in part, an unconscious being outside of himself who is simultaneously I and not I. The recipient is and is not oneself at a distance. The projector is becoming someone other than who he had been to that point. The projector's experience of occupying the recipient is an experience of negating the other as subject and co-opting his subjectivity with one's own subjectivity, while the occupying part of the projector's self is objectified, experienced as a part object, and disowned. The outcome of this mutually negating process is the creation of a third subject, the subject of projective identification, that is both and neither projector and or recipient. Thus, projective identification is a process by which the subjectivity of both projector and recipient are being negated in different ways. The projector is disavowing an aspect of himself that he imagines to be evacuated into the recipient, while the recipient is participating in a negation of himself by surrendering to, making room for, the disavowed aspect of the subjectivity of the projector. It does not suffice to say that projective identification simply represents a powerful form of projection or of identification or a summation of the two, since the concepts of projection and identification address only the intrapsychic dimension of experience. Rather, projective identification can be understood only in terms of a mutually creating, negating, and preserving dialectic of subjects, each of whom allows himself to be subjugated by the other, that is, negated in such a way as to become, through the other, a third subject, the subject of projective identification. What is distinctive about projective identification as a form of analytic relatedness is that the analytic intersubjectivity characterizing it is one in which the asymmetrical, mutual subjugation, that mediates the process of creating a third subjectivity, has the effect of powerfully subverting the experience of analyst and analysand as separate subjects. In the analytic setting, projective identification involves a type of partial collapse of the dialectical movement of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, resulting in the subjugation of the individual subjectivities of analyst and analysand by the analytic third. The analytic process, if successful, involves the reappropriation of the individual subjectivities of analyst and analysand, which have been transformed through their experience of, in, the newly created analytic third, the subject of projective identification. Projective identification can be thought of as involving a central paradox. The individuals engaged in this form of relatedness unconsciously subjugate themselves to a mutually generated intersubjective third, the subject of projective identification, for the purpose of freeing themselves from the limits of who they had been to that point. In projective identification, analyst and analysand are each limited and enriched, each is stifled and vitalized. The new intersubjective entity that is created, the subjugating analytic third, becomes a vehicle through which thoughts might be thought, feelings might be felt, sensations might be experienced, which to that point had existed only as potential experiences for each of the individuals participating in this psychological interpersonal process. In order for psychological growth to occur, there must be a superseding of the subjugating third and the establishment of a new and more generative dialectic of oneness and two-ness, similarity and difference, individual subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Although Klein, 1955, focused almost entirely on the experience of psychological depletion involved in projective identification, it is now widely understood that projective identification also involves the creation of something potentially larger and more generative than either of the participants, in isolation from one another, is capable of generating. The vitalization or expansion of the individual subject is not exclusively an aspect of the experience of the projector. The recipient of a projective identification does not simply experience the event as a form of psychological burden in which he is limited and deadened. In part, this is due to the fact that there is never a recipient who is not simultaneously a projector in a projective identificatory experience. The interplay of subjectivities is never entirely one-sided. Each person is being negated by the other while being newly created in the unique dialectical tension generated by the two. The recipient of the projective identification is engaged in a negation, subversion, of his own individuality in part for the unconscious purpose of disrupting the closures underlying the coherence/stagnation of the self. Projective identification offers the recipient the possibility of creating a new form of experience that is other to himself, and thereby creates conditions for the alteration of who he had been to that point and who he had experienced himself to be. The recipient is not simply identifying with an other, the projector, he is becoming an other and experiencing, what is becoming, himself through the subjectivity of a newly created other/third/self. The two subjects entering into a projective identification, albeit involuntarily, each unconsciously attempts to overcome, negate, himself and in so doing make room for the creation of, a novel subjectivity, an experience of I-ness that each individual in isolation could not have created for himself. In one sense, we participate in projective identification, often despite our most strenuous conscious efforts to avoid doing so, in order to create ourselves in and through the other who is not fully other. At the same time, we unconsciously allow ourselves to serve as the vehicle through which the other, who is not fully other, creates himself as subject through us. In different ways, each of the individuals entering into a projective identification experiences both aspects, both forms of negating and being negated, in this intersubjective event. It does not suffice to simply say that in projective identification one finds oneself playing a role in someone else's unconscious fantasy, Bayan 1959. More fully stated, one finds oneself unconsciously both playing a role in and serving as author of someone else's unconscious fantasy. In projective identification, one unconsciously abrogates a part of one's own separate individuality in order to move beyond the confines of that individuality. One unconsciously subjugates oneself in order to free oneself from oneself. The generative freeing of the individual participants from the subjugating third depends upon the analyst's act of recognition of the individuality of the analysand, and of himself, e.g., by means of the accurate and empathic understanding and interpretation of the transference, countertransference, and by the recognition of the individuality of the analyst, and analysand, by the analysand, e.g., through the analysand's use of the analyst's interpretation. Hegel's, 1807, allegory of the master and slave, particularly as discussed by Kojève, 1934–1935, provides vivid language and imagery for the understanding of the creation and negation, the superseding, of the subjugating third in projective identification. In Hegel's allegory, at the beginning of history, in the initial encounter of two human beings, each senses that his capacity to experience his own sense of I-ness, his own self-consciousness, is somehow contained in the other. Self-consciousness, in a rudimentary form, is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, in doing so it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other, at first, sees, only, its own self. Hegel 1807, page 111. Each individual cannot simply become a self-conscious subject by seeing himself in the other, that is, by projecting himself into the other person and experiencing the other as himself. He must overcome his being outside of himself, Kojève 1934–1935, page 13. Each individual is destined to remain outside of himself, alienated from himself, insofar as the other has not given him back to himself by recognizing him, p. 13. It is only through the recognition by an other who is recognized as a separate, and yet interdependent, person that one becomes increasingly, self-reflectively, human. One's being outside of oneself, for example, one's being within the subject of projective identification, is only a potential form of being. The act of having oneself given back by the other is not a returning of oneself to an original state, rather, it is a creation of oneself as a transformed, more fully human, self-reflective, subject for the first time. An intersubjective dialectic of recognizing and being recognized serves as the foundation of the creation of individual subjectivity. If there is a failure of recognition by each of the other, the middle term, the dialectical tension, collapses, in a dead unity, page 14, of static, non-self-reflective being. Each leaves the other alone, as things, and does not participate in an interpersonal process in which each gives the other back to himself or herself, thereby creating individual subjectivity. It is important to note that the use of the term and concept, intersubjectivity, is not a contribution of contemporary psychology, rather, it is an idea that for centuries has been used in philosophy in the way I have just described. The projector and the recipient of a projective identification are unwitting, unconscious allies in the project of using the resources of their individual subjectivities and their intersubjectivity to escape the solipsism of their own separate psychological existences. They each have circled in the realm of their own internal object relations from which even the intrapsychic discourse that we call self-analysis can offer little in the way of lasting psychological change when isolated from intersubjective experience. This is not to say that self-analysis is without value, rather, I believe that it has severe limitations when isolated from intersubjective spheres such as those provided by projective identification. Human beings have a need as deep as hunger and thirst to establish intersubjective constructions, including projective identifications, in order to find an exit from unending, futile wanderings in their own internal object world. It is in part for this reason that consultation with colleagues and supervisors plays such an important role in the practice of psychoanalysis. The unconscious intersubjective alliance involved in projective identification may have qualities that feel to the participants like something akin to a kidnapping, blackmailing, seduction, a mesmerization, being swept along by the irresistible frightening lure of an unfolding horror story, and so on. However, the degree of pathology associated with a given projective identificatory experience is not to be measured by the degree of coercion involved in the fantasied subjugation. Rather, pathology in projective identificatory experience is a reflection of the degree of inability/unwillingness of the participants to release one another from the subjugation of the third, by means of an act of recognition, often mediated by means of interpretation, of the unique and separate individuality of the other and of oneself. Of course, the separateness always stands in dialectical tension with interdependence. Summary. In this chapter the nature of the interplay of subjectivity and intersubjectivity that is specific to projective identification is discussed. In projective identification, there is a partial collapse of the dialectical movement of individual subjectivity and intersubjectivity and a resultant creation of a subjugating analytic third, within which the individual subjectivities of the participants are to a large degree subsumed. A successful analytic process involves the superseding of the third and the reappropriation of the transformed subjectivities by the participants as separate, and yet interdependent, individuals. This is achieved through an act of mutual recognition that is often mediated by the analyst's interpretation of the transference, countertransference and the analysand's use of the analyst's interpretation.